Hello and welcome to another trike bike video. In this video we are assembling the folding trike bike. If you lay out the box, you'll see everything is covered in shrink wrap, and after removal all the parts can be laid out on the box to prevent damage, so you can see what parts you have and what's necessary for the building process. Please refer to this video during the assembly. Different hardware comes with the trike bike, and this is necessary for the correct assembly. We'll start off by putting the rear axle assembly onto the bench, and we're showing you here two bolts that are already in place. We use these bolts to guide the frame into position. Quite often it's best if you have two people to help with this task, because it can be a little bit fiddly. But once we've got the frame aligned and on those two bolts, we can then go ahead and loosely fit all of the other bolts to the rear section. There are 3 bolts on each side. Once the bolts are in place, go ahead and fit the washer and then the nylock nut. These nuts only need to be finger tight, and when completed, do the same on the other side of the trike. We now want to align everything to adjust the rear sprocket position. Give the axle a quick tap over, and then come around to the single speed gear, loosen the Allen key and slide it across to the frame. Make sure the key goes with it, and then just gently tap it to give about 0.5 millimeter space between the frame and the gear itself. We can now go ahead and just tighten up the rear frame a little bit more, but we still don't want it to be tight because we need to slide the frame where it connects to the rear axle assembly. Now comes time to connect the chain. Locate the chain and lay all the parts out on the bench. You'll see here we've got the chain itself, the connection pin, backing plate and safety circlip. You'll need to unwind the chain to remove all of the kinks until you've got it in one straight length. Then drape it over the front sprocket, through the frame and around the back sprocket, and eventually bringing both ends together to connect the joining pin. This can be a little bit frustrating at times, so it's often best to have a second set of hands to hold everything for you. Sprocket to hold everything in place. This makes fitting the joining link much easier. Slide the joining link in from the back side, then put on the side plate, and finally the circlip. We then need to adjust the chain tension. In this position you'll see that it is very, very loose, and of course it will fall off when you ride. To adjust the chain tension, we pull the mainframe assembly away from the rear axle assembly, and by moving it backwards we can correctly tighten the chain. It is important, however, that you have the distance the same on both sides. And this is pretty easy to align when you are doing the bolts up. Once you have the first ones nipped up, you can then go through and tighten the rest of the bolts on the frame, and you need to do both sides. Now it's time to fit the front wheel to the trike. So remove the plastic end caps and then go ahead and fit the disc brake. The disc brake screws on in a clockwise direction. Make sure it is attached nice and firm. We then need to loosen the nuts on both ends of the wheel axle. We also pull the safety washers away from the middle of the axle out to where the nuts are located. This makes it much easier to fit when we attach it to the bike. Lift up the bike and drop it down on the front wheel axle. We now rotate the safety nuts so they align with the hole in the front fork, and just tighten up the nuts on each side, finger tight. Fitting the front disc brakes. We align the two screws on the caliper with the mounting locations on the front forks. Remove the bolts from the caliper assembly. Bring the caliper to the frame and then align everything on the disc brake. Once you have it aligned, you can then go through and put the bolts back into the caliper and it will hold everything correctly in place. In this video, we're not going to cover adjusting the disc brakes correctly, so you need to go to our website and have a look for the individual videos which will take you step by step through aligning the caliper and adjusting the brakes correctly. We're now ready to fit the seat, so locate the seat clamps and position them on the frame. It's really important to note on the folding trike how they sit. There's a special clamp that goes over the main area of the seat post. This is to stop the bolt from rotating and spinning freely. We then put a washer on the back and then the locking mechanism. For now, we'll just wind this on loosely. We can now drop the seat post into position and leave about 50 millimeters hanging out the top for now, and we can go ahead and lightly tighten the seat post, ready to fit the seat. The seat slides on the seat post, but be sure to keep it up fairly high, not down the bottom where it flanges out into a wider diameter. This is important because it allows the seat to clamp correctly. There's two 13mm nuts on each side of the seat, and it's necessary to tighten from both sides to get the absolute best clamping performance. It's now time to fit the handlebars, and these slide down into the handlebar stem, or what we call a gooseneck. Normally you'll need to twist them backwards and forwards to get them to drop in, and then you can again loosely tighten the special bolt on top. We then need to position the handlebars correctly, so with a 13mm spanner, slide the handlebars roughly into the correct position. It's now time to fit the chain guard. The bracket on the front of the trike has a little bit of movement in it so you can position it correctly. A small screw goes into the top and bottom brackets. For now we just tighten these loosely. We then need to go and align the rear bolt and tighten it firmly. Once this is completed, we can then go back and adjust and tighten the other bolts holding the chain guard to the chain guard bracket. It's time to fit the pedals, and you can see that each pedal is marked left and right as they're stamped into the shaft. The right pedal goes on the right hand side and the thread turns in the right hand direction or clockwise. The left hand pedal goes on the left hand side of the trike and its opposite thread, so it's a left hand thread. So you fit the left hand pedal by turning it counterclockwise. We're now ready to fit the rear wheels. Remove the doughnut and the normal nut from the rear wheel axle, then go ahead and remove the washer. You will see that the wheel axle on the right hand side has a special collar fitted to it. This is to engage with a similar part on the right hand drive wheel. Slide the wheel on, align everything and push firmly in place. Then goes the washer. A liberal application of Loctite, the normal nut and then the dome nut. We tighten these nuts to 40 Newton meters. So the wheel on the right hand side is fitted very firmly. On the left hand side, we remove the dome nut, the normal nut and the washer. The large collar that you see on the shaft remains on the shaft and pushes up hard against the bearing. We then fit the wheel. You'll notice that the wheel actually has a directional tread, so please look for the arrow showing you which way it goes. Then fit the washer, a liberal application of Loctite, the normal nut and finally the dome nut. The most important nuts on the whole trike are these ones, and it's important that they are not over tightened. We always use a torque wrench when tightening these nuts, and they are tightened to only 4 to 5 Newton meters. So this is basically just a little bit more than hand tight. We always recommend doing them with a torque wrench, but if you don't have a torque wrench available, Do them up as hard as you can with your fingers and then go another 1/3 of a turn. Lock all of these nuts down with Loctite just like you have on the other side, and make sure the dome nut is fully engaged against the normal nut. It's time to put air into the tyres, and on the folding trike we recommend 50 psi in all wheels. We now connect the cables to the brakes. It's important to align the adjuster knobs up correctly so the brake cable can fit between these slots. Insert the head of the cable in, push it down in place and make sure it is aligned in the adjuster. Twist the adjuster a little bit so the cable can't come out. You will see now everything's connected properly. We always get asked, what's this little screw for? Well, for people with things like arthritis that can't open their hands enough, you can wind this screw in and it will position the handlebar lever closer to the handlebar itself. It's ideal for people with arthritis and weaker hands. We then feed the brake cable through the guides on the frame and down towards the back of the bike. You'll often need 2 hands to guide the cable through and remove any kinks and twists that you can see in the cable before you pull it too tight. To fit the rear brake, we firstly put the end of the cable through the cable mount. We then put a spring over it, and the cable gets aligned and through the hole in the bolt on the brake lever itself at the rear of the frame. Using a 10mm spanner, we will then take out a little bit of cable tension and we'll wind this bolt up firmly. Any fine adjustments can be done when everything is connected. We're now fitting the front cable from the front brake. So we align it through the cable guide on the front fork and down into the caliper. The cable goes through the end of the caliper and the bolt is tightened to hold the cable in place. You then need to race off to our website and look at some other videos on how to adjust the braking system and aligning the caliper. We're now fitting the front mudguard. These are the parts that are necessary to fit the front mudguard with the folding trike. We will firstly go ahead and fit the mounting bracket using the stirrup. We will very loosely fit the backing plate and using a Phillips head screwdriver, just insert the screw a couple of turns. If you do it up too tight, you won't be able to fit the mudguard bracket. Once it's in place, go ahead and fit the other screw. Make sure everything is aligned properly so you have the same angles out the left and the right hand side of the mudguard. We fit the mudguard to the frame. So position it through, put the long bolt through, washer and nylock nut on the back. it's important to note that there's a lot of movement in this area which allows you to fine-tune the position of the mudguard and position it correctly so it'll fit and look great on the bike. Once you have the ideal position, you can go ahead and tighten all of the nuts and bolts as required. Fitting the basket to the trike is pretty easy. We attach the basket to the support frame using this hardware. We loosen the nuts on the end of the front wheel axle and we attach the basket bracket. Put the nuts on again, only finger tight. Once we have the front basket attached to the main axle, we can then go and swing the basket up in place. And we'll align with the mounting bracket on the gooseneck. Once everything is in position, we can then go ahead and tighten all of the nuts and bolts into their final positions. When doing the front wheel, pull it down so it's held firmly in the forks, and using a 15mm spanner, you can tighten everything up. We will then fit some plastic end caps to the front wheel axle. This just helps protect the thread from any damage. It's a requirement to fit the reflectors, and we always do this on the opposite side to the valve stem. So just slide it in place loosely, then fit in the special locking nut and tighten 1/4 of a turn. Do not over tighten this, otherwise you'll break them. It's time to fit the rear basket. So put it up onto the frame and using your fists and the tyres, align it centrally. Then the brackets can go into position. There's plenty of movement in this area, so you can always get them aligned up correctly. Once you have these 4 bolts through, you can then go ahead and connect the nuts. It's washer first and then nut. Fitting the rear mudguards, we firstly fit the reflector into position and put on the nut on the rear. We use an 8mm spanner to tighten this. Once the reflector is in place, we can then go and fit the mudguard to the rear mudguard brackets. For now, just finger tight on these screws. We only tighten these screws finger tight, so there is movement in the whole assembly to align it with the tyres when it's finally fitted to the trike. Again, a nice job where you need 2 people to help, but put the mudguard frame over the tyres and position the bolts through, large washer and then the nylon lock nut. We do the same in the other position on the other side. Now it's time to tighten the mudguard frame, and we suggest getting somebody to hold it in position for you level so you can do up the bolts without any issues of movement. We can now use the movement in the mudguard itself to align it with the tyres. Do these bolts up firmly. Go ahead and fit the whole rear mudguard assembly to the other side of the trike, just as you have already. This pretty much finishes the assembly process. You need to go over the bike one more time and check for any loose nuts and bolts. Check that the brakes are adjusted correctly. And make any final adjustments and tweaks that are needed. You're then able to go out and test ride and enjoy your trike for many years to come.